For generations, the movement of people across the 49th parallel was a defining characteristic of North American life. Canadians and Americans traversed the border with an ease, frequency, and casual familiarity that was the absolute envy of the global community. The United States-Canada border was not just the longest undefended border on Earth. It was an integrated cultural and economic engine. Millions of Canadians drove south every single winter, fleeing the ice and snow. They filled entire fleets of commercial planes bound for Orlando and Phoenix. They packed the casinos and convention centers in Las Vegas. They bought up vast swaths of condominium real estate in Fort Lauderdale, Naples, and Palm Springs. They spent billions of dollars in American communities, supporting local economies from the rugged coast of Maine to the sun-baked deserts of Arizona. That era, as I stand here analyzing the data in the early months of 2026, appears to be definitively over. I have covered this economic and geopolitical beat for months now, watching the data stream in week after week. At every turn, every metric, and every leading indicator, the story has gotten progressively worse for the American tourism and hospitality sectors. The border hasn't been closed by a physical wall or a pandemic lockdown. It has been closed by a profound psychological and economic rupture. To comprehend the sheer scale of this quiet catastrophe, we must look at the raw, unforgiving numbers. The aviation and border crossing data for the first quarter of 2026 paints a picture of a massive, unprecedented consumer boycott. In the first quarter of this year, Canadian airlines are operating nearly 10% fewer seats on flights destined for the United States compared to the exact same period in 2025. In the high-volume world of commercial aviation, a 10% drop is not a minor fluctuation, it is an earthquake. That percentage translates to approximately 450,000 fewer seats available in just the first 3 months of this year. Break that down further, and it means that roughly 5,000 seats are disappearing from the market every single day. That is 5,000 fewer hotel rooms booked, 5,000 fewer rental cars driven off the lot, and tens of thousands of restaurant meals left unserved on American soil on a daily basis. Regarding ground crossings, the data is even more staggering. According to comprehensive reporting from Statistics Canada and the CBC, the total number of Canadian personal vehicles traveling to and from the United States declined by a massive 30.9% in 2025 compared to 2024. The momentum of this decline is actually accelerating. Last month alone, 17.8% fewer Canadians returned from the U.S. by air compared to the same month last year, while automobile return trips saw a devastating 26.8% year-over-year decline. These are not seasonal fluctuations. These are seismic structural shifts in human behavior that have been sustained and deepening for over a year. Airlines are highly reactive, data-driven entities. They do not fly empty planes out of a sense of nostalgia. The strategic shifts made by Canada's major carriers over the last few months reveal a complete abandonment of traditional American cash cow routes. Air Transat. The most shocking development comes from Air Transat, a major player in the Canadian leisure travel market. By June of 2026, Air Transat will have zero U.S. service. The airline is executing a complete 100% exit from the American market. The historical flight between Montreal and Orlando officially ended on May 4th. The route connecting Quebec City to Fort Lauderdale ends on May 30th. The Montreal to Fort Lauderdale route will be terminated on June 13th. The airline has ruthlessly reduced its American exposure to less than 1% of its total global capacity. Where are those planes going instead? They are being redeployed to launch highly lucrative, sold-out routes to Senegal, Albania, and Iceland. WestJet, Canada's second-largest airline, historically a massive pipeline for Western Canadians seeking winter sun in the U.S., has implemented a severe 32% capacity reduction on its transborder routes. They have outright canceled 15 established routes for the summer of 2026. The casualty list reads like a map of major American hubs. Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, Nashville, Orlando, San Francisco, Seattle, Salt Lake City, and Phoenix have all seen routes slashed or abandoned entirely. Flair Airlines, Canada's prominent ultra-low-cost carrier, which built its business model on connecting budget-conscious Canadians to U.S. destinations, has slashed its U.S. capacity by an astonishing 58%. Air Canada, even the national flag carrier, which relies heavily on U.S. business travel and transit hubs, has been forced to reduce its overall U.S. seat capacity by 7%. The evaporation of the Canadian traveler is leaving a massive financial crater in the United States. Economic forecasting firms currently estimate a direct $4.5 billion loss to the U.S. economy due to the sharp decline in Canadian visitors in 2026 alone. This is not a theoretical loss spread thinly across the continent. It is highly concentrated, devastating specific American communities that spent decades building their local economies around the reliable influx of Canadian cash. But perhaps the most permanent damage is happening in the Florida real estate market. For half a century, Canadian snowbirds were the reliable backbone of the Florida condo and winter home market. Today, that market is freezing over. Canadian owners, spooked by the political climate and the plunging value of their currency against the US dollar in the wake of the trade war, are heavily listing their properties. Real estate agents in Broward, Collier, and Palm Beach counties are describing a chilling new reality. A market flooded with Canadian listings, but with absolutely zero Canadian buyers in sight to replace them. The generational transfer of Florida real estate among Canadians has simply stopped. It is crucial to understand that the Canadian travel dollar has not disappeared. Canadians have not stopped taking vacations. They have simply stopped taking them in the United States. The money is flowing, rapidly and aggressively, elsewhere. While commercial flight capacity to the U.S. is down between 10% and 14% across the board, flights to Mexico are up nearly 16%. The statistics reveal a stunning geopolitical realignment of North American travel. The Toronto to Cancun air corridor has officially overtaken massive domestic American routes, like the flights between Dallas and Houston, to become Mexico's absolute busiest international air route. WestJet, having abandoned its U.S. hubs, now operates 52% of all commercial flights from Canada to Mexico, and they are not stopping there. Canadian carriers are rapidly expanding deep into South America, launching massive new routes like Calgary to Sao Paulo, Brazil. Capacity and frequency to Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, and Panama are also climbing at double-digit rates. The Canadian tourism industry has successfully re-engineered its logistics network to entirely bypass the United States. How did the most stable relationship in the world deteriorate so rapidly? The shift can be traced directly back to February 2025, when the Trump administration unilaterally introduced punitive 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. However, macroeconomics and tariffs alone do not fully explain the depth, speed, and emotional intensity of this shift. What truly inflamed Canadian public sentiment and turned an economic dispute into a cultural boycott were the political comments and the aggressive rhetoric emanating from Washington regarding Canada's fundamental sovereignty. When high-level political surrogates began making dismissive suggestions about Canada, eventually becoming the 51st state, it triggered a massive psychological backlash north of the border. It offended a deep-seated Canadian nationalism that is usually kept polite and quiet. A recent comprehensive YouGov survey quantified this anger. A staggering 62% of Canadians stated they are actively less likely to visit the United States in 2026, purely due to the political climate. This cultural shift was compounded by intense practical friction points. Border friction. Reports flooded Canadian media of stricter, aggressive immigration enforcement at U.S. pre-clearance facilities, agonizingly longer wait times, and highly intrusive questioning by U.S. Customs and Border Protection agents. Crossing the border stopped feeling like visiting a neighbor and started feeling like an interrogation. Operational threats. Washington's openly discussed threats about potentially decertifying Canadian-made aircraft, specifically targeting the remnants of Bombardier's aerospace legacy, spooked the aviation industry, making the U.S. airspace feel like a hostile regulatory environment. The grassroots boycott. This culminated in an elbows-up protest culture. In Canadian cities, choosing to vacation in Mexico or Europe rather than Florida or Hawaii, is now viewed as an act of patriotism. Canadians actively view the cancelled U.S. flight routes not as a loss of convenience, but as a proud, defiant assertion of national sovereignty. The decline we are witnessing is not bottoming out. It is creating a dangerous negative feedback loop. As airlines cut routes, travel to the U.S. becomes more expensive and less convenient for the remaining Canadians who actually want to go. This reduced supply further suppresses demand, which leads to even more route cancellations. Many in the American hospitality industry have been holding out hope that the upcoming 2026 FIFA World Cup, jointly hosted by the US, Canada, and Mexico, will serve as a magical reset button, flooding American host cities with Canadian fans. That is an illusion. Deep skepticism remains among tourism economists that the tournament will reverse this entrenched trend. Because Canada secured its own highly capable host cities, Toronto and Vancouver, millions of Canadian soccer fans do not need to cross the border, spend US dollars, or subject themselves to US customs to participate in the global spectacle. They will watch the games on domestic soil, spending their money in Canadian hotels and restaurants. The structural changes we are seeing today, the permanent airline pivots to Mexico, Europe, and Africa, the sale of Florida real estate, the psychological shift in the Canadian consumer, are becoming deeply entrenched. What we are documenting is the real-time decoupling of two societies and economies that were once intimately intertwined. The United States economy is already $4.5 billion poorer for it this year alone. As the planes reroute to Cancun and Sao Paulo, the lingering question is whether anyone in Washington has the political courage or the diplomatic skill to stop the decline before the world's longest undefended border becomes a permanent cultural wall.